Hello, everyone. As you know, it's April 3rd, 2021, Easter weekend. I am Dr. Terry Hildebrandt, and I was invited today by Josh to talk about spiral dynamics integral and LGBT workplace equality, and that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. And I have been working on this for about 10 years and published a book chapter on this, and I thought you guys might appreciate some of the insights that have come from this. A little bit about me. I'm an executive coach and organization development consultant. I've had my own business for 13 years here in Denver, Colorado, but I do work globally and have worked globally for at least 24 years as an executive coach. Before I started my own business, I was at Hewlett-Packard Company for 22 years. I'm also a professor at the Fielding Graduate University, where I teach doctoral students in coaching and work at a number of other universities as well, including UCLA and Rice University, University of Virginia as an executive coach. If you want to find more about me, you can check out my LinkedIn profile here on the page, and I'll put that in the chat later. One of my core interests, in addition to leadership development, which is my primary business, has always been workplace equality for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender folks. And I still do a lot of diversity and inclusion work as part of my business. It's a smaller portion of my business, but it is something that I'm passionate about. And I was very interested to understand how spiral dynamics might fit in or inform the whole world of diversity and inclusion. And now they've added equity also to that. So we call it DEI as of the last year. So our learning objectives today are really to look at and understand a key vertical dimension of diversity, which is worldviews and values systems based on the work of Claire W. Graves and Spiral Dynamics Integral. So we often think of diversity and inclusion really being about gender, race, sexual orientation, national origin, etc. But spiral dynamics itself is a form of diversity. And I think we really need to appreciate that in a broader sense. Also, one of the things that Claire W. Graves talked about was the congruent management strategy. And he wrote a good article on this. If you haven't read it, you can get it on the web. But the basic idea is that based on where people are in their own level of current development, they will respond to different management strategies. So my premise here is that if we understand the individual and maybe organizational developmental stage of the people we're working with, we can customize our diversity strategies to that group, and they'll be more likely to accept what we're trying to do in terms of inclusion and diversity and equity. So that's part of, I'm specifically making this presentation about LGBT workplace equality strategies, but they're also relevant, I think, to racial and gender and other strategies. And we're looking at what might appeal to those individuals. So the agenda will include a very brief introduction to ECLET and spiral dynamics integral. I think most of the people on this call already have a deep understanding, or at least some understanding of spiral dynamics. So I'm not going to go much into it very deeply, but just for those who might listen to the recording later that may be a little bit newer to spiral dynamics, I will give a high level, very brief introduction. And if anyone needs a deeper understanding, they can check out my white paper, and I'll be happy to give you a copy of the chapter. If anyone is interested in that, they can email me. We'll be talking about deep values and worldviews, the various management diversity strategies and paradigms that are out there in the world. And this is consistent with integral theory that takes a lot of existing theory and maps it onto the integral map. So I'll be doing that with common diversity management strategies that you'll find in the literature that have been very well researched. I'll also share common examples of both LGBT oppression and support at each of the levels of the spiral, along with recommendations for workplace equality strategies, and looking at a systemic approach that respects, honors, and leverages The strengths of each of the SDI levels will either as a group or maybe if we have enough folks, we might do some breakouts to have some small group dialogue and report back on learnings and certainly some Q&A. The work that you find in this presentation has a lot more detail in the Handbook of Personal and Organizational Transformation that Springer Nature published just a few years ago. So I wrote the book chapter titled Spiral Dynamics Integral in Workplace and LGBT Workplace Equality. And if you're interested in a PDF copy of that book chapter, you can email me at terry@terryhildebrandt.com. But one of the key messages I want you to walk away with today is that there's another kind of diversity, which is how we think about our world and why we think this way. And spiral dynamics really gives us insight into this. And as we know, research has shown that individuals and cultures emerge along a predictable path. And understanding these key stages of spiral dynamics really can give us insight into how to understand ourselves and others, and certainly this understanding has application to workplace equality strategies. And just a little bit of background on where spiral dynamics comes from. Dr. Claire W. Graves, professor at Union College in Schenectady, New York. He died in '86, but he did a lot of research on human development and discovered and invented the emergent cyclical double helix model of adult biosocial biopsychosocial systems development. That's a long one to say. He sometimes called it the levels of human existence theory or the emergent cyclical levels of existence theory. And basically, Claire W. Graves wanted to know the answer to the question, how do we understand human nature? And one of his students asked him a question: which of these psychological theories was right, after his taking his survey class, which led to 21 years of research. And Graves' research found that, briefly, I'm proposing is that psychology of the mature human being is an unfolding, emergent, oscillating, spiraling process marked by progressive subordination of older, lower order behavior systems to newer, higher order systems as man's existential problems change. So that was from Claire W. Graves in 1974, and it summarized his whole theory. As most of you know, Dr. Don Beck and Christopher Cowan studied under Claire W. Graves and developed spiral dynamics as a result of that. And then later, Don Beck developed spiral dynamics integral, incorporating Ken Wilber's integral model. And the spiral dynamics added the nomenclature of colors and V-memes to popularize ECLET. And a V-meme, as most of you know, is a core value system, a worldview, or an organizing principle that permeates thought structures, decision-making systems, and various expressions of culture. Don Beck often calls them core adaptive intelligences. I like to think of it as worldviews. That's probably the closest word that maps, common understood ideas. But there is a key difference between a values system or VMeme versus what we know as values. So a value system is a biopsychosocial system that frames life priorities and worldviews and vistas on reality, where values are beliefs and ethical frames that prioritizes and expresses moralities. And when we look at spiral dynamics, there's these 8 different levels that currently exist, and they describe codes in people and cultures. They work both at the individual level as well as organization and even geopolitical nation state levels. So it's multiple levels of society, and it's kind of a new way of understanding and the forces of human interactions and behavior. And these are just a quick summary of the 8 levels. And I'm going to assume that most of you already know spiral dynamics, but in case you don't, you'll let me know, and I'd be happy to go a little bit deeper. But just as a quick rundown, as we know, beige is really about survival and psychological needs, hunger, sex. Before we got started, people were talking about some of those survival TV shows right now that are really talking about people moving back into nature and trying to survive without a lot of modern society's support. But there are very few natural human societies that are still at beige. There's one in India, I think, is the last one that people recognize. It's been isolated for a long, long time. Purple is what's known as kin spirits, which is more about safety, protection, placating spirits, honoring ancestors. You see this a lot in tribal societies. However, we all still have purple within us, so we all will have superstitious approaches or different ways we look at the world. And purple has a lot of meaning when you think about family systems or specific cultures, microcultures. Red is what spiral dynamics calls power gods. Graves called it the CP egocentric level. This one's more about power control, hedonism, sensory pleasure, exploitation. We see this a lot in cultures that are run medieval societies, which had all about survival and power. Blue is truth forced, also known as the saintly or absolutistic approach, which is about order, purpose, one right way, and salvation. A lot of the big religions with a holy book are often viewed as blue, but not always. They may be at other levels as well. But we know as fundamentalism is classically blue in whatever religion we're talking about. Orange is strive drive, which is materialistic or multiplistic, more focused on success, goal orientation, influence, autonomy, and achievement. Orange is the dominant meme still here in the US and a lot of post-industrial societies where we're talking about money, but also meritocracy, getting ahead through personal achievement. Green is the human bond or sociocentric, relativistic, personalistic approach. We see this mostly on the East Coast, West Coast, connection, harmony, humanitarianism, affiliation, love. These are often the green movements that you hear about are also called green in spiral dynamics. Yellow is what we call second tier, where people take a different approach and begin to look at things through learning, knowing, independence, systems thinking, self-worth. Claire Graves called that the momentous leap, where we're beginning to see yellow emerge in some limited ways, but still is not that common in the world. And then lastly, turquoise, which is also early, very early emergence here, more of a global view, I can hardly say that, experientialistic, intuitive, and differential, looking at synergy, so global community, world consciousness, and planetary concerns. A few people are emerging at turquoise, focused in on things like climate change and global issues that can't be solved in any other way. So that's just a brief summary. And also, if we look at the colors in spiral dynamics, the warm colors are the more focused on the self, and the more cool colors are focused on the we, self-sacrificing and focusing on more the inner world. So you can see there's a spiraling effect going from focusing on self versus the collective. A few of the key concepts in spiral dynamics that value systems or V-memes describe types in people rather than types of people. So we all have all the colors within us, or at least most of them, up to the level that we have evolved. None of the value systems is inherently better or worse. They all exist because they are designed to meet a certain life conditions that we may be experiencing. And as our life conditions evolve, so will the different thinking systems within us, or V-memes. Value systems describe how a person thinks, not what is valued. And value systems can ebb and flow as our life conditions change. So we may regress depending on our life conditions, or we may be propelled forward into more complex systems of thinking as our life conditions require that. Value systems can consist of an infinite number of combinations and patterns. So we like to think of it as mimetic codes that exist within us, and lots of different combinations, and they may shift over time. And everyone's motivated, but we're not motivated by the same thing. So this is probably one of the key ideas behind diversity management is the motivation is going to vary a lot depending on what your center of gravity might be right at any given moment around your value systems. It's also important to know that there's a couple other pieces to look at. There's always context. I mentioned earlier that life conditions are kind of what drive our development, according to Claire Graves' theory. And those are in our environment and challenges that we're dealing with. The themes are our coping systems on how we think and respond to those life conditions. And that includes our activated neuropsychological equipment in the brain. And then what we will notice as we observe different societies or individuals is displays, or what Claire W. Graves called schema, which are the surface manifestations of the particular forms of expression of the V memes. So V memes can look very different in different societies, different groups, different individuals. So it's important to know that blue in one society will look very different than blue in another. So we'll be talking about that a little bit, of some of the possibilities of what you may be noticing in your society, or even in yourself. Um, Also, Claire W. Graves called the combination of life conditions with coping systems together, those create an existential state, or a wave or level, or V meme, which is what spiral dynamics called them. The other thing about the V memes is that they do transcend and include, and they're holonic, as Ken Wilber would say. So, we continue to maintain all of the lower levels of consciousness within us as we continue to move up the spiral. So, as you could see here, this is a rough estimate, and you could debate these years, but this is what Don Beck and others believe when some of these different V memes emerged, and how they are continuing to emerge today. There are, like I mentioned earlier, two tiers. First tier are the first six, which tend to only see themselves from within their level. And there's often arguments and fights between the levels. Where when you move to second tier, which currently is yellow and turquoise, you begin to see the whole spiral and understand how the spiral each has its own purpose and value. So we continue to appreciate what came before, where if you're in the first tier level, you tend to discount the previous levels as you move up the spiral, and often will, for example, as orange will often not appreciate blue, and green will often fight against orange. However, yellow will see the purpose of all the previous levels, and appreciate those. So this is also really important when you think about diversity and inclusion, and being able to see the value of all the different value memes. This is just a quick estimate on where people are in the world today. And if you look at the whole global situation, we got still a lot of red societies, a lot of blue, with orange emerging and becoming bigger. In the US, we see a slightly different mix, a lot more orange. Orange is probably the dominant V meme, with a lot of green emerging, and some yellow. And this has created what we call the culture wars, commonly known in the US, between fundamentalists and blue, orange folks being like Wall Street types trying to really have profit be the primary motivator and power, and then green emerging with such, like the racial equality movements that we saw this last year, and global warming and climate change issues becoming dominant in green, where a handful of yellow folks are trying to sort this all out and come up with solutions that work across all this complexity. However, power is today controlled in the US primarily by orange. That's the major global corporations are still heavily orange, and most of the fundamentalist religious organizations in the South are blue. So that's where you see a lot of power struggles in the U.S. and the world. We still see most power in some of the developing nations are still red, and then blue being a dominant force, where global corporations in the world are more on the orange side. So as Don Beck continued to explore spiral dynamics, he discovered Ken Wilber's integral theory and then added that, and it was always there. If you think about even the original work of Claire W. Graves, it was biopsychosocial, which is basically the concept of integral theory, but it was more formalized by Don Beck, about 15 years ago. So you could see here the map that is now spiral dynamics integral. So that was my introduction to spiral dynamics. Hopefully I didn't bore too many of you that already knew a lot about spiral dynamics, but for those who are new to spiral dynamics, hopefully it'll give you a foundation of what we're talking about here and the rest of the program. I'm going to switch gears right now and talk a little bit about what is going on in terms of diversity management strategies. This is R. Roosevelt Thomas Jr.'s diversity paradigm. And what he discovered is there are a lot of different ways you can manage a mixture of things. And this isn't only people, it could be anything else in the world as well. But you could either include or exclude. You can deny that the diversity matters and explain it away. You can assimilate by taking the minority components and incorporating them into the dominant culture. That's what we talk about, the melting pot of the U.S. We used to describe that last century that way. You could suppress diversity, and you can also isolate it and keep it separate. You could tolerate it, or begin to build relationships, and then at the highest level, foster mutual adaptation. And if you look at these just at a high level, you can begin to see the spiral here, right? The spiral tends to show up even in R. Roosevelt Thomas's model. And if we look at a couple of other models, this is a combination of Thomas and Eli and Dess and Parker. They built off of each other and said there are mainly four big diversity perspectives, which is what Dess and Parker called them, and Thomas and Eli called them diversity paradigms. Resistance is one that you see where diversity is viewed as a threat, and the goal is to maintain the status quo and homogeneity. So this is either to exclude folks or try and minimize diversity. Sometimes this is viewed as a reactive strategy, and more often than not, you'll see this in the red V memes. And let me just describe this a little bit in more detail. So organizations operating under the resistance perspective work to protect the status quo and see diversity as a non-issue or threat. The dominant power group maintains control by excluding people different from them. Dass and Parker note the primary approach to diversity is reactive, characterized by denial, avoidance, defiance, and manipulation. The resistance paradigm is still active and well across the world, especially in regard to LGBTQ equality. In the last few years, a plethora of legislation has been proposed to allow discrimination based on sexual orientation on the basis of religious freedom. So-called bathroom bills have been proposed and passed by state legislatures to prevent transgender people from using bathrooms consistent with their gender and expression. The resistance paradigm has much in common with the red V meme. Graves described the egocentric existence level as consisting of haves and haves nots, and those in power believe they have the right to behave in whatever way they choose to further their own goals without guilt or regret. Cohen and Torodvik, and the world is seen as a jungle full of threats and predators. The resistance paradigm is common in organizations where the external and internal pressures to change are minimal. However, as minority groups gain power and companies face lawsuits, which are known as beta conditions in spiral dynamics, this approach is much less tenable, and the paradigm for managing a new paradigm for managing diversity arises. And we began to see a lot of that in the 60s, where the discrimination and fairness paradigm emerged. And the goal of the discrimination and fairness paradigm is to level the playing field for those who have been traditionally left out due to prejudice and discrimination. And Thomas and Eli found that organizations are successful in using this paradigm are often top down structured and bureaucratic in nature, with clear codes of conduct which are enforced, measured, and rewarded by management. Organizational members widely hold the value of fairness, and the paradigm is often associated with equal opportunity policies, affirmative action laws, and anti discrimination laws, and tend to focus on disadvantaged groups. Success in diversity initiatives is measured by progress toward recruitment and retention goals. Advantages to this paradigm is that it can increase demographic diversity and fair treatment. However, this paradigm also assumes that all employees should be treated the same. This results in color blindness or gender blindness, where employees and organizations deny that differences exist. A common mantra might be, we are all just people. The organizational culture requires that minorities suppress their differences and assimilate into the mainstream. Harvey J. Coleman offers advice to minorities on how to assimilate and argues that minorities can empower themselves by learning the unwritten rules of the organizational game. This results in minorities shifting between different personas at work, at home, and in their communities. The discrimination and fairness paradigm fits well within the blue V meme, and Graves noted that at the saintly or absolutistic level of existence, people are driven by specific rules of proper behavior. The organizational structure at this level is pyramidal and authoritarian. The organizational culture focuses on one right way of doing things. Beck and Cowan and organizational members respect the authority of management, value order structure, rules, and laws. The concept of fairness, central to the discrimination and fairness paradigm, is in alignment with the blue V meme thinking. In the 80s and 90s, we saw a new paradigm emerge called the access and legitimacy paradigm, and it promised, with the promise of increased profits and market share by tapping into growing multicultural markets, in which Thomas and Eli labeled access and legitimacy paradigm. Management argued that to better serve diverse markets, the workforce needed to reflect the diversity of the customer base. The mantra changed to diversity isn't just fair, it makes business sense. This paradigm also tends to broaden diversity beyond disadvantaged groups to make any element of difference and incorporates the concepts of inclusion into its vocabulary. The paradigm has the advantage of being market based, but has the disadvantage of isolating diversity and exploiting employees. The market based foundation provides a strong business case for diversity due to its focus on the bottom line. However, Thomas and Eli note that management tends to isolate diverse employees by having them focus on niche markets rather than integrating their expertise in a larger organization. Diversity in this paradigm is often tolerated, but not truly accepted as equal to the dominant culture. Minority employees are often viewed as legitimate and necessary for the success in multicultural marketplaces, but they are not integrated or accepted by the mainstream. This can result in employees feeling exploited by the organization. The access and legitimacy paradigm is an expression of the orange V meme in spiral dynamics integral. Graves described the materialistic or multiplistic level of existence as allowing diversity of thought, but still maintaining that there is one best way. The value of the orange V meme include accomplishing and getting, having, and possessing. The theme of this V meme is express self for what self desires. but in a fashion calculated not to bring down the wrath of others. In the orange thinking, diversity is viewed as a necessary tool for prosperity and competitive advantage. Minorities share in the success of the enterprise, but their approaches are not considered the best way or equal to the dominant culture. Some elements of the access and legitimacy paradigm also show evidence of green V beam thinking. The personalistic or relativistic level of existence is primarily concerned with acceptance, belonging, and harmony with others. Das and Parker note that this perspective not only recognizes differences but also values them. The mantra here is celebrate diversity. Organizations may use diversity awareness training, multicultural fairs, and sensitivity training. In R. Roosevelt Thomas's junior paradigm, this is called build relationships. In green thinking, employees move beyond tolerance to acceptance of difference. However, this increased sensitivity and understanding are not integrated in the core capabilities, processes, or power systems of the organization. Another common drawback to green thinking is that valuing all differences equally may seem to ultimately value none. Managers may be unwilling to act in support of the unique needs of one employee group due to fear of being perceived as to favor one minority group over another. In the learning and effectiveness paradigm, which is the fourth one in the Das and Parker model, organizations learn from employees' diverse perspectives and integrate this knowledge into the core intelligences, processes, structures, missions, and cultures to enhance the effectiveness and efficiency of the organization. Thomas and Eli describe that as the mantra here being leveraging the power of diversity. The dominant power systems change to incorporate multiple perspectives. The work itself gets diversified, not only the workforce. The learning and effectiveness paradigm acknowledges that both similarities and differences are important. While the access and legitimacy paradigm previously focused on assimilation of diversity into a homogeneous culture, the access and legitimacy paradigm encourages differentiation into niche markets, and the learning effectiveness paradigm then focuses in on integration. Um, Thomas and Eli, managers value differences as rich sources of creativity and look for areas of synergy and commonality to unite teams. The learning and effectiveness paradigm incorporates the goals of previous two paradigms. It includes compliance with anti discrimination laws, fairness, and access to new markets. However, it also seeks innovation, customer satisfaction, employee development, and social responsibility. The learning and effectiveness paradigm is an expression of yellow V meme thinking. The integral level of existence begins with the second tier of existential states and represents a momentous leap in human thinking and development. The theme of the yellow V meme is to express self for what self desires, but never at the expense of others, in a manner that all life, not just my life, will profit. In this worldview, knowledge and competency are more important than status, organizational level, or power. Organizations operating at the yellow V beam center of gravity demonstrate flexibility, spontaneity, functionality. People operating within the yellow thinking not only value diversity, they embrace it, listen to it, and incorporate its wisdom. The yellow V meme also values and respects the other V memes. It transcends and includes them. So I've described a little bit here how these various approaches to diversity are consistent with the various values memes. I also, based on spiral dynamics, would like to hypothesize a next diversity management paradigm, which I believe is beginning to emerge. And using spiral dynamics integral, we should be able to predict this. Beck and Cowan describe the V meme after yellow as turquoise or holistic or whole view. The basic theme of this level is to experience the wholeness of existence through mind and spirit. Turquoise level thinking is concerned with synergy among all groups and life forms. It looks for opportunities to create balance at a global level. Global problems require global cooperation, which puts the planetary concerns such as global climate change above the desires of narrow group interests. Collective imperatives and mutual interdependencies reign supreme. If diversity management thinking follows the SDI prescribed evolution, as it has in the past, we should be able to make some predictions regarding what the next paradigm will look like. I propose the title of Interdependence and Cooperation Paradigm for the next wave or level of diversity management thinking. Multinational corporations are working on a global basis more than ever before. Supply chains for product and service delivery run across national and geographic boundaries. Companies are offshoring many elements of support and service to India and China. Today, when an American customer calls most major computer manufacturers' support phone numbers, they will frequently be talking to someone in India or Costa Rica. The explosion of the internet has also flattened the world by creating instant information access and publishing ability. The Institute for the Future argues that a cooperative strategy will be required for success in business in the 21st century. IBM's global program manager for LGBT workplace diversity, Brad Salovich, notes that IBM has implemented a global non discrimination policy inclusive of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Motorola and Symantec are also working across countries and cultures to develop standards of behavior that create respect, cooperation, and synergy on a global basis. A group of 29 international human rights experts released groundbreaking international legal principles on sexual orientation, gender identity, and international law in an effort to chart the way forward for both United Nations and governments to ensure the universal reach of human rights protections. Also, others have advocated for a three-pronged equality strategy consisting of government, regulation, employers, and trade unions, complementing and reinforcing each other. The above demonstrate a clear trend toward global interdependence and cooperation. So the next thing I'd like to explore with all of you is looking at how spiral dynamics integral specifically relates to LGBT equality. And as we all know, if you've studied spiral dynamics, you know there can be what we might call healthy expressions at each of the V memes and not so healthy or unhealthy expressions. So those can also be correlated to LGBT oppression and support at each of the V memes if you're thinking about workplace equality. There are also advocacy and diversity management strategies that you can specifically design for each level of the spiral. And I'd like to also show how organizations can move through these V memes as their life conditions change. And certainly in the last year, we've seen the life conditions can change with the death of George Floyd and many other minorities that have been tragically murdered over the last few years. And I'm going to briefly share some of these, what it looks like for each of the levels. However, if you would like to see more detail, you can go to my specific paper, and we'll be doing that some in the breakout sessions for each of the four quadrants. But just for the sake of time, I'm going to just summarize this at a little bit of a high level. So if we look at purple, which is known as kin spirits, one form of LGBT oppression is that you can often see that LGBT people are demon possessed, ill, or cursed. And growing up, this is what my church taught, that LGBT people were demon possessed. And there are many churches in the U.S. and worldwide that still believe that. Many times LGBT family members are disowned and LGBT people are excluded or fired for coming out or remain deep in the closet. And the LGBT community itself can be divided into factions. which often fight each other. Gay men versus lesbians or bisexuals can often be excluded. And forms of support at the purple level, many of the early pre-Christian Native American tribes and other indigenous communities viewed LGBT people as special or gifted, such as the Native American Two-Spirit, as they're often called. Many of the shamans and other healers were gender nonconforming folks, and that's well documented. Same-sex attraction was viewed as natural variation of human sexuality, and we see that in India in some of their earlier religious texts as well. Elders and leaders were welcomed as full members of the family and tribe if they were LGBTQ. And blood was thicker than sexual orientation and gender identity. The tribal membership was more important. So some of the strategies that you can use at the purple level is provide exposure to LGBT affirming role models, talk about LGBT people culture and development, encourage healthy exploration of sexuality within the safety and support of the tribe, develop special rituals or traditions, such as honoring the coming out process or commitment ceremonies, and integrate LGBT people into the tribe with special roles, which certainly Native American tribes, many of them did, thousands of years ago. And elders and leaders can demonstrate inclusion. Some of the key messengers that can deliver this are respected leaders, or in the organizational setting would be company founders. Red forms of oppression or view that individuals who are in LGBT communities are viewed as weak. There's internalized homophobia and fear of being outed, and queer bashing and harassment are rampant, open, blatant discrimination without remorse or guilt. Gay jokes are frequently heard. Gender nonconformity is punished. LGBT individuals hide or deny their attractions. They're seen as weak or inferior. The gender binary is believed to be normal, and gender nonconforming people would be viewed as sick or aberrant. LGBT people stay in the closet. They're isolated and shunned, and or only hired for low status jobs like that, but not leaders. Forms of LGBT support in a red environment is that they understand they're different from others, but accept and honor their uniqueness as strengths. And LGBT individuals are out and proud and respected for their power and influence. And sexual orientation and gender identity is really irrelevant. LGBT people boldly accept themselves, demand respect. You see that in pride parades and other kinds of opportunities for LGBT pride. It often comes out of that red perspective. LGBT employees succeed based on their power and influence in any positions. And you start to see LGBT pride groups or employee resource groups forming. Strategies at this red level is offer tangible, immediate rewards for inclusive behaviors. Focus on what's in it for me with straight coworkers, and use powerful, successful LGBT role models. Educate people on the strengths and power of LGBT people. Develop LGBT leaders, and companies can support LGBT pride parades and festivals. The messengers here are people with recognized power and LGBT people who have been very successful in the world. Blue, which is again one of the dominant colors in the world today, where we see a lot of oppression more commonly is, and the forms of LGBT oppression are that only heterosexuality is deemed normal. We call that heterosexism. People believe God must be punishing them, or they are evil. And you see this in some of the reorientation programs that with counselors that try to change sexual orientation in children or young people. LGBT individuals try to deny their feelings and attractions. Gay people are expected to suppress their identities to conform to heterosexual norms. Some attempt to assimilate into heterosexual life, or they believe to be a threat to society and are evil. And institutionalized heterosexism is everywhere. Gender stereotypes and gender Binary mental models are the norm. Many believe homosexuality is a sin or abnormal. And there's anti-gay legislation or anti-trans legislation, which there's a whole bunch of that happening just this last week in the South. And discrimination policies and procedures exist, such as denying health care or not allowing transgender students to use the right bathrooms or not to have access to sports. Forms of LGBT support at the blue level, that being out at work is normal and expected within guidelines set by the organization, and that both gay and straight people are expected to abide by the same social norms as dictated by the rules. Employees should be treated with respect, dignity, and fairness. Sexual orientation and gender identity are included in non-discrimination and non-harassment policies, and standards of personal conduct policy respects gender and sexual minorities, and you treat all employees the same according to the rules. So you see there's a lot of rule-based stuff in blue, and you can enforce that through policies. One of the other strategies for dealing with the blue culture is appeal to their respect for authority and duty, set superordinate goals for higher purpose that unites all the employees across personal differences, publish values that the company stands for and respects dignity for all employees, set expectations that employees will be treated with respect and dignity. Leaders and managers set clear behavioral expectations, enforce the rules with consequences. You can add sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression and non-discrimination and non-harassment policies, and you need a zero tolerance policy for LGBT harassments. And the messengers here, people in with position, power, or rank, and definitely using the chain of command. For those who are interested, I did a more full study. It was a qualitative research study with people who had actually transitioned from heterosexual evangelical Christians being anti-gay to pro-gay. And if any of you are interested in learning more about how do you actually get someone who is deeply committed to blue anti-gay ideas from a Christian perspective and how they became pro-gay, and many of them still Christian, you can check out my study and learn more about it. But one of the key themes is that a personal crisis, which is typically unrelated to same-sex sexuality, preceded changes in beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. So that crisis in their life caused them to reflect on their previously held beliefs and assumptions regarding what they had been taught by their prior evangelical churches. And it was very consistent with what spiral dynamics says is that, beta condition crisis that causes people to change. So I did see up-leveling and development for many of the folks in this study as they went through that journey from anti-gay to pro-gay. If we go to Orange, Orange has forms of LGBT oppression as well. In this case, LGBT people see themselves as second-class citizens. They are comfortable being out. They don't feel valued. They're tolerated but not accepted or valued as people. They're viewed as resources or overhead expense rather than assets. And coworkers see them as competitors. And the organizational game or stepping stones to be used as personal gain. Oftentimes they're relegated to their expertise in a particular area. And often sexual reassignment surgery is not offered due to a small number of employees impacted and the small return to the company. I actually heard one company I was with gave that as an argument because it didn't make business sense to offer that and didn't have enough impact. Forms of LGBT support is that employees are valued and they believe their unique gifts add competitive advantage to the organization, and they see being gay as an advantage. They could further their careers and a valuable market that can be used to increase sales to the company. And a more live and let live philosophy tends to emerge, and domestic partner benefits are used as a marketing recruiting tool. An organization is known as Queer Blind, being gay doesn't matter, in the Orange system of meritocracy. Some of the strategies here is develop LGBT employees and leaders with mentoring programs, emphasizing the business case for diversity, discussing the negative impact of heterosexism on productivity and creativity, pursue the LGBT market for profit and revenue share. One organization I was with, we did a lot of that, targeting the LGBT market, recruiting employees, LGBT employees for creativity, leveraging employee resource groups to meet business goals, offering domestic partner benefits and sex reassignment surgery for trans people to improve the company's image. Messengers here are credible professionals and gurus and diversity experts and successful mentors and models. Green, which is where you probably hear most diversity inclusion consultants coming from these days. But Green still has its own level of oppression as well. Green in an oppressive environment believe that all people should have equal voice except those who are intolerant to their relativistic views. So they only accept people that believe what they believe. They resist the concept of hierarchy and holacracy as elitist. We call this the cancel culture. You see, the cancel culture is what Green has created in the last year or so. It's a preoccupation with being politically correct, getting stuck in consensus decision making, and trying to please everyone. And we'll fight the blue beam's absolutistic one right worldview as oppressive, as opposing to valuing blue for what it brings. Unwilling to make moral stand for fear of being labeled as narrow-minded or exclusive. They lose competitive drive to win in favor of cooperation. They suppress LGBT differences and unique needs and attempt to focus on what all humans have in common, and they make excuses for red behavior by blaming the environment or society. Forms of green LGBT support would be LGBT people see themselves as unique individuals with something to offer the LGBT community. LGBT people are fully accepted and valued as people. Everyone is given a voice as long as they respect others' rights. Company and employees support civil rights legislation for LGBT people and believe that everyone should live in harmony and community. Caring friendships are developed across people with different sexual orientations and gender identities, and straight allies. Support for social justice and LGBT equality in a workplace and community. And spousal equivalency policies and practices exist. Today, we have gay marriage in the U.S., but not in every country. So this is still important in many different places in the world. Some strategies, if you're working with a green organization, is educate the workforce on the impact of discrimination and oppression. Use diversity fairs, dialogues, awareness training, and speakers to build understanding and relationships. Discuss unique value of LGBT culture and people, appeal to the values of green, of social justice, human rights, and dignity. Suggest supportive actions that LGBT allies could take to further equality, support LGBT nonprofits and social causes, create LGBT support groups. The messengers here are LGBT trusted colleagues and friends and family of LGBT people, such as PFLAG, or victims of anti-LGBT violence. If we move on to yellow, everyone thinks yellow's perfect, but it really isn't. Yellow has issues too. So forms of LGBT oppression here is they can appear to be thinking at V-memes of lower complexity due to systemic worldviews. So sometimes green is a little shocked by some of yellow's statements because they don't understand what it means to be fully integrated into the whole spiral. So that can be confusing for some employees because yellow might surprise you in what they come up with. They may at times trade off the interests of LGBT employees for the greater good. And moving up and down the spiral can seem like moving backwards. Without context, actions might seem contradictory. And yellow will at times conflict with the green meme by making unpopular decisions that violate green values. If we look at forms of LGBT support, all forms of diversity are embraced and seen as valuable. The motto for yellow is thrive and help thrive. Works globally across cultures and nations for LGBT equality using appropriate strategies for the mimetic codes in operation. This is a really key key bullet because yellow knows that not everything will work. Green ideas won't always work in a red culture. So you have to customize your strategies based on what's showing up in that particular group you're dealing with. They accept others where they are in their development and adjust their approach accordingly. They remove barriers to growth, helping to keep the spiral open to change, and they develop linkages and coalitions across diverse groups. So one of the strategies you might see in coming from yellow is educate on the systems and context of LGBT issues and the need of people at each level of existence across the spiral. Understand key functions LGBT people play at each level of the spiral and respect their knowledge and support their development and education, design flexible systems and organizations and policies that match the multiple levels of existence and the capacity, needs, and culture of people at each level. Provide access to information resources to create big picture views and monitor systems and invite them to be part of the solution and to lead. And messenger safe can be any useful resource that can bring insight in yellow. Do want to just briefly talk about turquoise. This is kind of new and emerging, so it's tentative. But if we look at forms of potential turquoise oppression, they may see LGBT people as only one of the many valuable expressions of life on Earth. Therefore, they may at times not fully appreciate what they may uniquely need. So they see all the mimetic codes as equally valuable and necessary, but may believe that the needs of one group, such as LGBT, at times may need to be sacrificed for the greater good. And LGBT people as a minority may get lost in the big picture. Forms of turquoise support may take a spiritual approach to the connectedness of all types of people, including LGBT people, facilitate healing across people and cultures, rely on ability of the brain to see complexity and patterns, be more collaborative, have a global view with the greater good of the planet and its inhabitants in mind, and creating global networks of interconnected groups. LGBT people then become represented as equals. Um, and some strategies educate on complexities of sexual identity development for all humans, educate on how LGBT people fit into the larger global human system, and picture LGBT people as equals with unique gifts integrated in the global human system, establish global standards of civil rights and workplace equality for all LGBT people worldwide. And messengers here are peer learning, mostly from others in the turquoise community. And there's not very many, so that can be a challenge for sure. Here's some common chords. As we know, the V-memes don't exist in isolation. They exist in combination, and we all have these different V-memes within us. But here's some like what you might call archetypal examples, such as the pro-LGBT Western corporation. These might be people like Apple or Hewlett Packard or any of the major organizations that it largely the company culture espouses. Primarily orange with some green values mixed in. They're still for profit, but they may have some humanistic approaches. Many of the individual employees, however, may hold strong blue religious and blue orange work ethics, especially if they exist in parts of the world that are primarily blue. Many LGBT advocates and allies exhibit green thinking, so you'll have some advocates pushing the boundaries there on green with a little bit of an emergence of yellow. So that might be what you would see in a classic big global Western corporation. Here's a example of a multinational global corporation. The company culture, again, spouses primarily orange with some green. Again, they may have, especially in early developing nations, you may have purple and red-blue thinking systems. So this becomes a little more challenging as you have operations that are really, across the world. The visionary leaders show yellow thinking and more global perspectives and challenges need to be addressed. We run into this quite a bit when we had operations in the Middle East, which many as more red-blue in some of those countries. And being LGBT, if you are found having sex with a same-sex person, you will be put to death. So that could be a real huge problem, and you're dealing with a red-blue local system of laws in a global multicultural organization. And that's an example of this. Here's another one. We have anti-gay regional companies. You might think here, Chick-fil-A. You might think here organizations like that have challenged some of the pro-LGBT laws in the courts, or they're anti-gay family-run businesses. The leaders and founders espouse blue-orange culture. So either they're very conservative fundamentalist Christians or have some very conservative values. Many of the individual employees may hold blue religious and traditional blue orange Protestant work ethic values, or may exhibit fundamentalist thinking. And then purple traditions exist with and rituals of the founders, and red systems such as overt harassment, power plays, and bullying of LGBT people might be tolerated in this kind of organization. So some of the common conflicts that you see in the spiral, if we look at beige, they're mainly focused in on survival, as in the movie The Quest for Fire. In purple, we're talking about protecting the myths, ancestral traditions, or rights of kinship and sacred places. The reds are more focused on dominating and gain the spoils and earn the right to rape, pillage, and plunder. Right? It's all about power. Blue is more about protecting borders, homelands, hearth, preserve way of life, defend the holy cause. Protecting traditional values is probably what you hear in America a lot on blue, and that when they have conflict. Orange is about advancing economic spheres of influence, access to raw materials and markets. You hear that a lot with lower taxes these days, or trying to maintain low levels of barriers to global commerce. And then green is more about punishing those who commit crimes against humanity or protecting the victims. So here you see a lot of the cancel culture showing up today. So these are just some examples of what that might show up as. When you see conflict on the spiral, you may see conflict at the same level or between levels. That's what we call the culture wars. When you see all the different legislation and arguments between blue, orange, and green right now. Also, the second tier levels of yellow and turquoise are more promoting alternative nonviolent means of problem resolution. As we know, the prime directive for spiral dynamics is promote health throughout the entire spiral and develop these meshworks and strategies to integrate, align, and synergize efforts and stakeholders, and search for that master code that generates adaptive intelligences. As we see common LGBT-related conflicts, we have blue thinking anti-gay religious fundamentalists versus the green thinking progressives. We often see blue thinking progressive pro-gay advocates. There are blue pro-gay advocates as well, and they are people that believe that everyone should be treated with love. So some of the fundamentalist Christians I know are pro-gay, but they come from the perspective that everyone, God is love, and everyone should be treated with respect. But sometimes we also have anti-gay social conservatives as well, so that would be an example of, fighting within the blue meme itself. Orange thinking corporate leaders versus green thinking social activists. We see this a lot right now with, Black Lives Matter, which I believe is mostly green, is fighting sometimes the half-hearted attempts or of orange companies to exploit a diversity and inclusion at the moment for their own goals. Red thinking gay bashing rebels versus green thinking pro-gay advocates. We still have a lot of gay bashing going on, especially with trans folks. Trans people of color are being killed and murdered every month in this country, and sometimes it's visible, sometimes it's not. We even have a transgender day of remembrance because so many trans women have been killed and murdered in the last 10 years in the US. Some of the common mistakes that people make with diversity and inclusion work is using green thinking, awareness building, and relationship building techniques to educate blue thinking, anti gay religious conservatives. This will not work. They will resist fiercely because you are violating some of their core values of blue, or using green thinking techniques to manage red thinking. Red thinking doesn't care at all about green. They more care about power and who can be effective. So you have to be careful about that, because many diversity inclusion consultants are green in their thinking, and they often will clash with the reds in a big way. So here's what I might suggest if you guys are up for it, is to do a little bit of an exercise via reflection, determine which V-memes maybe best describe your own organization where you work, or if you have your own company, what do you think is showing up, and how those people in your organization might have multiple V-memes operating at once, but choose the one or two V-memes that seem to be most prevalent in your organization. And if you want to see more descriptions, you can put the link here into the chat. I'll paste that in there, and you can look at them. We have a small enough group. We probably want to just stay in one group to maybe do this, or also include some Q&A. But I would love to hear where you see areas of LGBT oppression and support in your own organization, and what strategies you think might work the best to try and move things forward in a more spiral dynamics approach.